History, as they say, is written by the victors. But let's be honest, sometimes the stories of the losers are way more interesting, especially when their deaths are so strange and so gruesome, they sound like they've been ripped from the pages of a fantasy novel. Royal executions are nothing new. A king's path to power is often paved with the heads of his rivals. But what happens when that rival is your own brother? And what happens when the execution itself becomes a legend, a whispered tale of unspeakable cruelty? For centuries, one story has stood out. It's about a prince, brother to a king, executed for treason. But how he died is where the facts get blurry and the wild myths take over. There are whispers of a death so horrific it's hard to imagine, being boiled alive in molten lead. Then there's the more famous, more theatrical tale, that this prince was drowned in a giant barrel of his favorite wine. This is the story of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, a man born into a civil war, a prince who stood one heartbeat from the English throne and whose ambition led him to a mysterious end inside the dark walls of the Tower of London. We're going to unravel the bizarre myths and chilling rumors to find out what really happened to this royal rebel, separating the grotesque fiction from the even stranger truth. What if I told you a royal prince was executed by being boiled alive in molten lead for betraying his brother, the king? It's a gruesome tale. But the other famous story about the death of George, Duke of Clarence, is that he was drowned in a barrel of his favorite wine. In this video, we're going to figure out what really happened. To understand how a man of royal blood could meet such a strange end, you have to understand the brutal world he was born into. George Plantagenet was born on October 21st, 1449. He was the third son of Richard, Duke of York, and this wasn't just any noble family. His father was a direct claimant to the English throne, which made his very existence a threat to the reigning king, Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. George's childhood wasn't about peaceful palace life. It was defined by the Civil War that tore England apart for decades, the Wars of the Roses. This wasn't a war between countries, but a brutal fight between two branches of the same family, the Lancasters and the Yorks. George was a prince of the White Rose of York, and from his earliest years he knew nothing but uncertainty, exile, and violence. When he was just 10, his father and older brothers were forced to flee after a major defeat, leaving George, his mother, and his younger brother Richard at the mercy of their enemies. A year later, their fortunes turned, only for their father to be killed in battle. In the chaos, young George and his even younger brother, the future Richard III, were shipped off into exile for their own safety. This constant cycle of victory and defeat, of power and peril, would forge George's character. When his eldest brother Edward finally crushed the Lancastrians in 1461 and seized the throne as King Edward IV, George's life changed overnight. He was no longer the son of a defeated claimant. He was the brother of the King of England. At just 11 years old, George became the Duke of Clarence, and with his brother Edward still unmarried, he was now the heir to the throne. This closeness to power, mixed with a volatile and entitled personality, was a dangerous combination. George grew into a man described as charming, but also deeply ambitious and moody. He'd spent his youth watching power change hands through betrayal and bloodshed, and he seemed to learn one lesson. Loyalty was something to be spent, not honored. He saw himself as a king in waiting, and it wasn't long before his resentment found an ally in a man who would fan the flames of his ambition into open rebellion, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man we now know as the Kingmaker. The seeds of George's betrayal were sown, as they so often are, over marriage and money. The man who helped him turn against his own brother was their cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick had been a huge help in putting Edward IV on the throne, but their relationship had soured. The Kingmaker felt his influence slipping, especially after Edward's secret marriage to a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville. Warwick saw a perfect pawn in George. The Earl had two daughters, Isabel and Anne, and his plan was simple: marry his older daughter Isabel to the Duke of Clarence. King Edward IV, sensing the danger, forbade the match. He knew that uniting his ambitious brother with his most powerful, disgruntled subject was a recipe for disaster. But George and Warwick ignored the king. On July 11, 1469, they sailed to Calais, where they held the wedding in open defiance of a royal command. This wasn't just a wedding, it was rebellion. Immediately after, they issued a public statement denouncing the king's evil counselors, a clear attack on the Queen's family, and declared they were coming to rescue the king. The rebellion moved fast. Warwick's forces defeated the king's army, and in a shocking turn, King Edward IV was captured. For a moment, it seemed like George was on the verge of getting everything he wanted. But the plan fell apart. The country wouldn't accept Warwick's rule, and Edward, a skilled politician, managed to regain his freedom and patch things up with his brother. The peace didn't last. By 1470, Warwick and Clarence were plotting again and were forced to flee to France. There, Warwick made a shocking new alliance with his sworn enemy, the exiled Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. The deal was sealed by marrying Warwick's younger daughter, Anne, to the Lancastrian heir. For George, this was a disaster. Warwick's new goal wasn't to make him king, but to put the old Lancastrian king back on the throne. George was now just a pawn. As Warwick invaded England and successfully restored the frail Henry VI, George found himself in an impossible spot. He had betrayed his brother for a cause that now had no use for him. Realizing his massive mistake, and likely persuaded by secret letters from his family, George made his final switch. When his brother Edward IV returned from exile in 1471 to reclaim his kingdom, George, Duke of Clarence, abandoned Warwick and rejoined the Yorkist army. At the Battle of Barnet, George fought against his own father-in-law. The kingmaker was killed in the fight. George had helped his brother secure the throne once more. He was pardoned and restored to royal favor. But the trust was shattered. He had proven himself to be, as Edward would later call him, a man of unnatural, loathly treasons. His treachery was forgiven, but it would never be forgotten. We are right in the middle of one of history's most fascinating family betrayals. We've seen George's ambition and his treachery, but the story only gets stranger from here. We're about to dive into the accusations of black magic, the paranoia that consumed the Duke, and the final fatal showdown with his brother, the King. And of course, we'll investigate those bizarre execution myths. Do you think a king could really execute his own brother by drowning him in wine? Let me know your initial thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this journey into royal history, please take a moment to subscribe to Ancient Vault and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. After 1471, an uneasy peace settled over the House of York. On the surface, George was back in the fold, even inheriting a chunk of his late father-in-law's massive estates. But it was all skin deep. A bitter feud erupted between George and his younger brother, Richard, over the inheritance. Richard married Anne Neville, Warwick's other daughter, to claim his share, and the brothers were at each other's throats for years, forcing King Edward to play mediator. But the real spiral began in December 1476. His wife, Isabel, died shortly after giving birth. While historians today believe she likely died from childbed fever or consumption, George became utterly convinced she had been poisoned. Consumed by grief and paranoia, George's behavior became reckless. In April 1477, he had one of Isabel's former ladies-in-waiting, Ancarette Twinihoe, kidnapped from her home. He dragged her to Warwick, put together a sham jury, and had her tried and hanged for supposedly poisoning his wife. This was a flagrant abuse of power. George was acting like a king in his own right. King Edward couldn't ignore such a direct challenge. At the same time, George's ambition flared up again. The Duke of Burgundy had died, leaving his daughter Mary as the richest heiress in Europe. George, now a widower, wanted to marry her. Edward flatly refused, probably fearing what his unstable brother would do with that much power. Enraged, George stormed out of the royal court. This was the beginning of the end. The king launched his own investigation, not into Isabel's death, but into George's household. The Crown arrested one of George's men, an astronomer named John Stacey. Under torture, Stacey confessed to using black magic to predict and plot the king's death. He implicated another man in George's circle, Thomas Burdett. Both were executed for treason. This was a clear warning shot, but George, in his arrogance, chose to ignore it. In a moment of breathtaking recklessness, he had another man burst into Parliament and read aloud a declaration of Burdett's innocence. This was the final straw. King Edward had endured his brother's betrayals, his plotting, and now his open defiance. He summoned George, berated him publicly, and accused him of treason. George, Duke of Clarence, was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. In January 1478, Parliament met to pass a Bill of Attainder against him, a legal move to declare someone guilty of treason without a trial. What made this so extraordinary was the prosecutor. It wasn't a lawyer, it was King Edward IV himself who stood before Parliament and laid out the case against his own brother. He accused George of spreading rumors that the king was illegitimate and his marriage invalid, claims that would make George the rightful heir. No one spoke against the Duke but the king, and no one answered the charges but the Duke himself. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. George was condemned. On February 18, 1478, George Plantagenet was executed privately within the Tower of London. The execution of a prince of the blood was a serious matter. A public hanging, drawing, and quartering, the usual fate for a traitor, was out of the question for a man of George's rank. Instead, the execution was done privately inside the Bowyer Tower. And it's this secrecy that has fueled centuries of speculation. Let's start with the most gruesome myth, that George was boiled in molten lead. This story shows up in some later chronicles, but there is absolutely no contemporary evidence to support it. Medieval executions were brutal, but this wasn't a standard punishment for treason in 15th century England. The boiled-in lead story is almost certainly a later invention, a bit of ghoulish folklore. Now for the most famous legend that George, Duke of Clarence, was drowned in a butt of malmsey wine. A butt was a huge cask holding about 105 gallons, more than enough to drown a man. Malmsey was a rich, sweet wine, a favorite of the English nobility. Unlike the lead story, this rumor started spreading almost immediately after George's death. So, why wine? One theory is that George himself, when offered a choice of execution, sarcastically asked to be drowned in his favorite drink, a final bitter joke. Another theory is it was a dark, mocking gesture from King Edward, a cruel commentary on his brother's well-known heavy drinking. Some even whisper it was a final jab at Queen Elizabeth Woodville, as Malmsey was supposedly her favorite wine. The story was so compelling that Shakespeare used it in his play Richard III, cementing the legend in the popular imagination. But is there any hard evidence? Direct proof is scarce. However, according to anecdotal reports from when his tomb in Tewkesbury Abbey was opened, his skeleton was said to be complete, with his head still attached. This is interesting because the typical execution for a nobleman, even in private, would have been beheading. The fact that he apparently wasn't beheaded lends some credibility to the idea that an unconventional method was used. Drowning would fit. Another tantalizing but speculative clue comes from a portrait that is believed to be of George's daughter, Margaret Pole. On a bracelet she wears in the painting, some have interpreted a small barrel-shaped charm. Is it possible this was a private, symbolic tribute to her father's strange death? So what's the most likely truth? The boiled-in lead story is pure myth. The official record just says he was privately executed. However, the rumor of drowning in malmsey wine appeared right away, was recorded by multiple sources, and isn't contradicted by the anecdotal reports about his remains. While we can't be 100% certain, it remains the most historically plausible account of how George met his end. It's also possible his body was simply transported for burial in a cask of wine to preserve it, and the story grew from there. But in an age of brutal politics and larger-than-life personalities, the bizarre death of a prince in a barrel of wine feels strangely, poetically plausible. So, what can we say for sure about the bizarre death of George, Duke of Clarence? We know that on February 18, 1478, he was executed for treason against his brother, King Edward IV. We know this was the result of a lifetime of reckless ambition and paranoia. George was a product of the Wars of the Roses, a man for whom loyalty was always conditional and power was the ultimate prize. His repeated betrayals and his open defiance of royal authority made his downfall almost inevitable. We can confidently dismiss the myth about him being boiled in molten lead. The truth, while still hidden in the secrecy of the Tower of London, likely lies within that more famous legend. The story of his drowning in a butt of malmsey wine is the most persistent and plausible account we have. The rumors at the time, the dramatizations by Shakespeare, and the suggestive physical evidence all point away from a standard beheading and towards something far more unusual. The death of George Plantagenet is a chilling reminder of the price of ambition in the 15th century. He was a brother to two kings, Edward IV and the future Richard III, yet his royal blood couldn't save him from his own self-destructive nature. His execution was both a personal tragedy and a stark political statement. No one was above the king's justice. The story has captivated people for over 500 years because it combines family drama, political intrigue, and a central mystery with a uniquely memorable ending. Ultimately, whether he was literally drowned in a cask of wine, or if that story is just a potent metaphor for a man consumed by his own excesses, we're left with the fact that his life ended in disgrace, ordered by the very brother he had both served and betrayed. What do you think really happened in the Bowyer Tower that day? Let me know your theory in the comments below. Thanks for watching Ancient Vault.